Welcome to Three Questions with MotionPoint. I'm your host, Dominic Dithurbide, and today I have the absolute pleasure of being with Major Masa, Global Marketing Manager at the Absolute Group. Major, how you doing? Thanks for being on.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone, or good evening, or wherever you are in the world. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here and to take part and share some thought leadership around marketing strategy. So absolutely, thank you for giving me the time.
Absolutely. The pleasure is all ours. So let's just dive into it.
Mhm.
I mean, Major, you worked with a lot of global brands, right?
Yeah.
The world's biggest brands, you could say. And
Mm.
I want to ask you, when expanding into new markets, what's one factor that you see companies underestimate or deprioritize the most?
That's a great question. So in most cases, I would say that it's about understanding the cultural context in brand positioning. So from my point of view, many brands assume that their existing value proposition automatically resonates to the local audience or to the different markets. But in often cases, it's not exactly it is. So sometimes
Hmm.
we need to understand the consumer behaviors, the perceptions, some category dynamics, because there are a lot of local brand players that are actually strong in some regional areas
Hmm.
that needs to be factored in. And what's aspirational in one country may not necessarily be aspirational for another country. So the level of experience and how people perceive each things are very different because again of the cultural biases that there is in those markets. So it can be relevant and irrelevant. So it matters. It depends on what the information is. And companies sometimes and sadly do not invest upfront in some cultural insights. And for
Hmm.
me as a marketer, knowing the consumers, understanding the market, and really deep diving into what are the pain points and what are the joy of every consumer you're targeting is important. Because while there is a general feeling of emotions on things, but the nuances and how those are expressed and on
Hmm.
how those are experienced varies from market to market. So from my point of view, when companies don't invest enough upfront in understanding cultural insights and consumer research, there is a strong risk of launching wrong positioning, or perhaps
Hmm.
even pricing, or even a product format, or even an innovation in that market. So the best global brands, in my point of view, actually spend a lot of time in understanding the local landscape and then also tweaking their approach accordingly so that it becomes more relevant and resonating to the target audience in the specific market that they want to be in.
That really resonates with me too. I've seen the same thing. It's almost as if, um, perception is more real than what you communicate, and
Mm.
what you are trying to say and the words that you choose, whether or not they're accurate semantically, or the meaning that you're trying to ascribe to what you're saying is correct. The way
Mm.
that it's perceived is actually more important, and therefore the idiosyncrasies of every culture, the different
Correct.
mannerisms of different people within those cultures, matter. So the way that they're going to interpret that message has to be something that you engineer and think about very intentionally, so that
Mm.
even if you're saying or bringing a very innovative product to market, and describing it in a way that's working for your flagship brand or your flagship language or country,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean, even though it's a benefit, that it's going to be
Mm.
properly perceived and adopted. And I think,
Yeah.
uh, why do you think that is, Major? Because I see that a lot. Why do you think
Mm.
people just figure that since it works in one, it'll work in another market just that
Yeah.
easy?
Um, Definitely comes from an unconscious bias, right?
Yeah.
In most cases,
Yeah.
some of the companies and brands group some markets in the same sort of cultural context, even if they're actually different nuances. Case in point, for example, um, markets normally would tend to group UK and the US just because they're both English-speaking countries. But
Hmm. Yeah.
cultural, there are huge cultural difference there. Even both markets speaks the same English. The understanding of the same English word is different between the two countries.
Yeah.
Um, Most of the general cases also, and many are guilty about this. For example, Africa is considered to be as one country and treated like as one country, when in fact within
Yeah.
Africa themselves, there's different cultural nuances and different perceptions, and there are different religions. There's a different language and whatnot. So it's varying experiences there. So I guess it comes from perhaps, and rude, I might be rude to say this, that perhaps at ignorance for that matter,
Yeah.
wherein some of the people who are probably sitting in these positions, they are probably not as globally exposed or not globally well averse of the different cultures. So it's very important from my point of view, if the people are working in a global team, you need to have a diverse group of people so that you can sense check once in a while the some of the difference and some cultural understanding. Because if you are, say, in a global company, say a global company in the US, and they're all just Americans, I don't think that's driving a global agenda from my point of view. So there would always be a missed step along the way in terms of understanding a different market and a different culture, because you have no one in that company that you can sense check and that you can leverage some information on. So from my point of view, it's probably the unconscious bias and also the lack of understanding and the lack of representation in some of the organizations.
Yeah, I think it's super right what you're saying, and sometimes a company will lump. It's kind of like the act of lumping, right? That
Mm,
just because it works here means it'll work there, and assume that other people understand it. I feel strongly about the diversity, and it doesn't even mean that they have to not be American, right? But like people that have explored other countries, maybe learned other languages,
mm,
or have interacted enough with travel and other
yeah,
cultures to in their gut know that it's not going to be apples to apples when you explain something in one market to another. So
yeah.
that's brilliant, and I think that does tie into the next question, which is,
Mm,
you know, again, like you've worked with some of the biggest brands in the world, right? The Absolute Group is huge, and when working with an established global brand, like, do you find that companies are prioritizing preserving their brand's cultural
mm.
heritage from where they come from, or do you see that they all do focus on adapting to local markets? Like, how much is standardized? How much is customized? In your
Mm.
experience, what have you seen?
So for this one, it really depends on the brand. Depends
Right.
on your positioning in terms of whether you're a luxury brand, a mass stage, or a mass premium brand, or a mass brand. So it really depends, right? And also
Hmm.
what kind of brand you have. But historically rich brands tend to prioritize heritage for sure. So if you look at all those luxury brands, heritage is very important, especially for brands that demands a certain price premium for consumers to pay. So
Yeah,
heritage
yeah, because
is
you're buying
important.
that, right? It
Yeah,
becomes
because
also
you're
a point of
buying that heritage
differentiation.
as well.
Yeah,
Exactly. So
that's
while
true.
challenger brands or in the lifestyle driven brands, they lean more into local adaptation. So when you say lifestyle brands are like Nike, for example, or Adidas, even Absolute, for example, and Kahlua,
Hmm.
these are all lifestyle brands. So we tend to lean on towards local adaptation, while heritage can be a very strong differentiator that if leveraged well by some of the brands who has strong history, but building that authentic and very credible point of view is important. And however, heritage from my point of view alone isn't enough if it's not connected with some local audiences in a relevant way. So even if you have a strong heritage, but if you're not able to convey it in a way that can be appreciated by the local other markets,
Yeah.
of course, it's not going to resonate to them. Um, so the best global brands, from my point of view, find ways to modernize their legacy while keeping it culturally resonant, right?
I
So for
love that
example,
sentence.
think
Modernize
about
your legacy.
yeah, exactly. Think about Absolute. So Absolute has a strong Swedish heritage for that
Hmm.
matter.
Hmm.
But how we try to be contemporary and relevant to every market is finding that red thread of what cultural platform that is globally accepted or is globally resonating. So Absolute as a brand, from my understanding, whilst I don't work with Absolute directly as a brand, they support a lot of the LGBTQ communities. They support about diversity. It supports the arts. So these are global red threads that everyone, no matter which market you are, can be expressed differently and can be
Hmm.
experienced differently as long as you're in that specific theme of these pillars of culture. So think about brands like Absolute, like I said. So we have maintained their deep-rooted history while making themselves, feel fresh and relevant, depending on what culture, or how can you infiltrate this culture in those aspects or in those theme. So on the other hand, newer brands or perhaps more emerging brands that are more lifestyle driven are more fluid in adopting regional trends and aesthetics. So some of these
Mhm.
technology brands for that matter is very fluid. So depending on, for example, I'd say Netflix, while it's not really new, but it's one of the newest, I would say, big brands. So the way Netflix would be adapting itself to different markets is different. So for example, they have different shows for different markets. They have different listings. They have different approach in terms of campaigns and whatnot for every market. So because they tend to be more fluid in terms of their positioning and they try to be more relevant to what the market needs are.
That makes total sense, and I think that's a really good point. I mean, if your heritage is not part of your points of
Yeah.
differentiation, that then you don't have to, you know,
Lean
what
on
you did,
it. Yeah.
which is like modernize your legacy. You just get to adapt to that right
Mm,
away. But there are certain pillars of mankind in music and
mm,
food
correct.
and love and
Yeah.
celebration,
Mm,
and if you're able to tie the way that a different market expresses
mm,
these pillars of humanity to your brand, even though, let's say in Mexico, I'm Mexican, we love our mariachis. If you can tether that to Absolute
exactly.
Vodka as an
Mm,
example, right? Versus
yeah.
in Spain, you might talk more about I don't know, salsa dancing, right? But trying to find a platform within something that is beloved by consumers of whatever
Or
products we're talking
yeah.
about.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you can also leverage your heritage and borrow some elements around that heritage that would be resonating for consumers. So I'll speak from the core. Kahlua as a brand is a Mexican heritage, is a strong Mexican heritage brand. It's
Hmm.
founded in Veracruz, Mexico. And the way we talk about Mexico is not in saying that, hey, we're Mexican and so on, but we express our Mexican heritage through the spirit of Mexico, being colorful, being dramatically playful. We're borrowing the specific cues about Mexico to highlight in some of our executions. And that's how we try to be constantly relevant by borrowing the specific elements that makes the heritage.
Yeah. Yeah, and you merchandise that, you
Mm,
turn that into a competitive advantage.
mm,
An example of that would be, I don't want Absolute Vodka to be manufactured in Mexico. I want it to be from Aarhus, Sweden, I believe, right?
exactly,
Like,
which they are. And all of Absolute vodkas are produced in Aarhus, Sweden.
yeah,
And everything is sourced in in Aarhus, Sweden.
yeah. So you that's what you're buying, right?
Mm,
You're not, same with champagne, like, right? Like it's
exactly.
called champagne because you want it coming from the province of Champagne, or the city of Champagne. Forgive my ignorance if I'm getting those wrong, but yeah, it's because that's comparative advantage. But localizing that messaging, and providing that story of where it comes from and why that should be romanticized,
Mm,
is unique to every market that you're going to try to penetrate, and
right.
that requires a lot of fun exercises of
Mm,
finding the parallels and
yeah.
doing your research, and then implementing your findings in a nice marketing
Mm,
strategy. So that's really cool, right? It's a difference between localizing product versus localizing messaging, and
yeah.
and what sometimes you need to do it, sometimes you don't. Like
Mm,
McDonald's definitely localizes their products, in different countries. They
markets,
offer
yes.
foods that are
Mm,
not necessarily offered everywhere, right? But it's
correct.
still, but at the same time, it's still consistent in that they all smell the same, I believe, right?
There
So,
is one star product that is probably consistent across, which
right,
is highly linked to the brand or iconic to the brand for that matter.
right, absolutely. Oh, well, this is a great conversation.
Mm.
Moving on to our last question here, I'd ask, um, well, in your experience, what's the biggest challenge in balancing brand consistency with the local market preferences?
Well, um, the biggest challenge, I think, in determining what's truly non-negotiable to a brand's DNA, so versus what should be flex to meet the market needs. So Every brand has its own DNA. There are specific
Mm-hmm.
elements there that makes up a brand, right? So part of that is the purpose, your tone of voice, your values and personalities. So there are areas that you need to define that these are the things that needs to be consistent and non-negotiable. And then there are areas that you're okay to flex and can be expressed locally to the audience. So brands are actually forced sometimes to have this very rigid approach that doesn't resonate locally. And sometimes there is a point of being over adapting as well, that it loses the core identity of some
Yeah.
brands. So for me, the key is to identifying that specific thread and the fundamental foundations or elements that must remain consistent, such as from my point of view, the purpose of the brand. It needs to be consistent across all, no matter which market you are going to be. The tone of voice of the brand, because this is how you show up as a brand, which will make you differentiated for your competitors. And some of the key equities, such as your attributes, values, and personalities as a brand. So these are non-negotiables from my point of view. So while at the same time, we allow some meaningful adaptation in messaging, perhaps in execution, or even in product strategy and innovation for that matter. So it's a very fine line in terms of getting it right to what separates truly global brands and those who are struggling to gain some tractions in the local markets.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I find challenging or could be challenging is the unconscious bias towards prioritizing only the key sizable markets while actually neglecting some of the smaller yet emerging ones. So many brands tend to focus on the largest revenue driving, which makes sense from a business standpoint, obviously. But there is a tend to also overlook the importance of representation in markets that may be small today, but are actually to be growing in influence in the future. So there is, these can lead to, a lack of inclusivity, a lack of understanding in global campaigns, or perhaps some missed opportunities to really establish that early connections about high potential regions. So from my point of view, successful global brands have strategies that take balanced portfolio approach. Obviously, you take importance to the sizable and important markets, but do not overlook and neglect the small ones that can drive potential growth in the future, so they need to be represented. So we need to ensure that while major markets drive the core business, the smaller ones are actually needs to be nurtured eventually, and with thoughtfully creating some campaigns that are culturally relevant that also represents these other markets.
That's brilliant. I think that's totally true, and you said it very well. What we have to do in those types of exercises as marketers is make sure that we isolate really the core of the brand identity, and that's like unshakable ground. Like that's your foundation. I took a class once in college called intercultural communication, and they described people as either coconuts or avocados.
Okay.
So bear with me. So like the coconut is hard on the outside, but then once you're inside, like it's easy. Everybody's a family, right? So it's hard to break in. But an avocado is more like, they say Americans are more like avocado, like really nice for everybody, very easy to get along with, but like it'll be hard to be part of that core. It'll be very hard for you to become part of that core if you're not like, someone that's always been there. I don't know why I thought about that, but it just reminded me of what you're describing, where it's, you when you're expanding as a brand to multiple markets, you got to act a little bit as an avocado, where you keep that core right consistent, and then the rest of it can be a little bit malleable, a little bit adaptable, and can change. And that's a hard thing to do, because that core has to be communicated in another language.
Absolutely.
But it still has to represent in the same manner the identity as it is in English, or the original language, right? So
that's why it's important for every brand to really define what's their DNA. It may come in different forms. It can be a brand house, it can be a brand key, it can be a brand disc, whatever shape and size it comes in. It's important to define the DNA and what the brand stands for and what makes up that brand, because you will not be able to then define what are your non-negotiables if you don't have it. So for example, one of the brand DNAs is like what cultural or consumer insight that you want to leverage. So that aspect can be flexed because cultural and consumer insight can vary from market to market. So you can change that or flex that depending on the market because you need to understand that specific consumer in that market, which will go through a different kind of experience. But the way you will leverage that cultural and consumer insight for your brand needs to resonate and link back to your non-negotiables, such as your tone of voice, your purpose, right? And your values and personalities and whatnot. So it's really linking those things together.
Yeah, which is also a form of art, right? AI can't do that.
Yeah.
So this is a great conversation. I really appreciate it, Major. Is there anything else you want to leave us? Any final thoughts?
Final thoughts. If you're a marketeer, stay curious, continue to learn, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. Don't walk the plank.
Yes.
You know, ask why. Ask why we're doing all this stuff. Thank you very much, Major. That does it for 50 questions with MotionPoint. Thank you, everybody. Till next time.
Bye.